The skull in the bag. I worked for the police department in a small town in Montana. One day we received a complaint. A homeless man was wandering around town with a bag containing a human skull. Well, typical for a vagrant, but we had to check it out. We radioed around asking officers to detain him if spotted. By evening, they brought him in. The old man was dirty, reeked, but sober. Sure enough, there was a skull in the bag. We started questioning him about where he got it, but he was talking nonsense. He couldn't remember his name or where he was from. Of course, the skull could be linked to a crime, so we decided to confiscate it. As we started packing it up, the old man had a meltdown, screaming, "Don't take it, I'll die." My partner, Alex, decided not to torment the man, who was clearly out of his mind. He called in a forensic expert to examine the skull. Meanwhile, he kept questioning the vagrant. The man claimed it was his skull. Not in the sense that it belonged to him, but that it was his own skull, part of his skeleton. Alex, a patient man, asked how that was possible if his head was still intact. The vagrant couldn't explain, but insisted it was true. The forensic expert arrived, examined the skull, and said it was old, but to be sure, he needed to take a sample. He took a scalpel and started scraping something off the bone. Suddenly, the vagrant grabbed his head and screamed in pain. The expert stopped, collected the samples in a piece of paper, and put it in his pocket. The vagrant calmed down. We decided to run a quick check and send the vagrant to a mental hospital. Alex called other departments asking if there had been any reports of grave robbing. Nothing. Then he tried to find a hospital that would take him, but everywhere refused, saying they were full or understaffed. Alex decided to keep him overnight and went home. The next morning he returned to find the vagrant lying on a bench outside the station. Turns out he smelled so bad that the officers on duty had kicked him out. He cried and begged to be let back in, but eventually fell asleep. They also said he'd been rambling about a sorcerer or an evil spirit, so they nicknamed him the Evil Spirit because of the unbearable stench. By noon, the forensic expert came back with a preliminary analysis. The skull was old, but it didn't seem like it had been buried for long. It was over 100 years old, but he couldn't be more precise. Alex called the local museum, asking if any bones had gone missing. Nothing. Then he got busy with other cases, and the vagrant stayed on the bench. Alex brought him food, but there was nowhere to send him. A few days passed. During that time, the vagrant told his story. It was strange but detailed. He said he used to live a good life, had a family, but forgot everything. The only thing he remembered was his fear of death. He was so afraid of dying that he met some kind of entity, a man with black eyes, no whites, and a reddish glint in his pupils. The man told him he would die if his skull was shattered, but if he carried his own skull with him, he could live as long as he wanted. He agreed, took the skull, and from that moment, forgot his name, family, and everything else. Alex felt sorry for him, but there were more pressing matters, especially since a serial killer was on the loose in the county and everyone was busy with that. Alex's boss got angry when he heard about the vagrant. He decided the skull wasn't evidence and ordered it destroyed. He took a hammer and smashed the skull to pieces. "Here, give it to him," he said. Alex went outside, and the vagrant was lying by the bench. His head was deformed as if someone had smashed it with a hammer. He was dead. We called the same forensic expert. He shook his head. He'd never seen an injury like that. There was no blood, but the skull was shattered. The case was closed. The body and skull fragments were cremated. All documents were destroyed to avoid further questions.
Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any new creepy legends and mystical tales. There's a lot more to come, so stay tuned and be ready for more encounters with the unknown. Look out for the next story.